At 72 years old, Margaret Whitfield thought she had learned every kind of cruelty a family could produce. She was wrong. What Wendell's distant cousin did to her on that gray October morning would have broken most women her age. What she found that same night, sewn into the hem of her dead mother's gardening apron, would expose everything he had done and save a piece of West Virginia that 3 generations of women had bled quietly to keep. If you believe that the truth always finds its way home, if you believe that a mother's love does not end at the grave, then stay with me. Hit that subscribe button right now and join our community. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories that prove it. Now let me tell you about Maggie Whitfield and the orchard that remembered her name. The farm on Hollow Pine Road had been in the family for 3 generations, which meant it had stood in those West Virginia hills longer than the county road that ran past it, longer than the little feed store in town that everyone used as a landmark, longer than most of the trees except the apple orchard on the south side of the property. Eleanor Blackwood had planted that orchard in the summer of 1968, the summer Maggie turned 14. It had outlasted everything. It had outlasted the hard winters of the 70s, the ones where the snow came up past the porch railing and the mail truck could not get through for a week at a time. It had outlasted the drought of 1988, when the creek at the back of the property ran so low you could walk across it on dry stones. It had outlasted the ice storm of 1994 that had taken 4 of the oldest trees in a single night. The sound of them breaking in the dark, something Maggie still remembered with her whole body. It had outlasted the slow, quiet attrition of time that takes things from you, whether you are paying attention or not. The orchard had outlasted Eleanor herself, who had died at 89 in 2015, in the same back bedroom where Maggie had been born. And Maggie had tended it for the 11 years since her mother's death, in her mother's name, in the way her mother had taught her, with the consistent quiet attention that was the only language the trees understood. Margaret Whitfield had lived on this farm for all of her 72 years, which was not something many women could say about anywhere anymore. She had been born in the back bedroom with a window that caught the morning light. She had grown up in these rooms. She had married Wendell Whitfield in that front parlor at 23 in the spring of 1977, wearing a dress her mother had sewn for her and carrying a bouquet of apple blossoms from trees that were only 9 years old then. She had raised their only daughter Corinne here, had walked Corinne to the school bus on Hollow Pine Road through 18 winters, had watched her drive away to college, and then to architecture school, and then to Portland, Oregon, where she had built a life that was her own. She had buried Wendell 4 years ago in the churchyard 3 miles down the road. She had stood beside his grave on a January morning when the ground was too frozen for proper flowers, and she had put her hand on the stone and said, "I will keep going," because the farm required continuing and because she was the kind of woman who continued. She had worked as a community nurse for 30 years, carrying her black bag up hollow roads to homes where people could not afford the drive into Charleston. She had delivered 3 babies in kitchens. She had sat with dying men in back bedrooms, holding their hands, reading to them from scripture or from the paperback novels their wives brought her. She had set broken bones by lantern light during the ice storm of 1994, when the power was out for 6 days and she walked 2 miles in knee-deep snow to reach a child who had fallen off a sled. Her hands had always belonged to other people's pain. When she came home each night in those years, Wendell would be waiting and the kettle would be hot. And her mother, Eleanor, for the years that her mother still lived with them after Maggie's father died in 1991, would be at the kitchen table with a book open in her lap. The 2 women would nod to each other without needing to speak. Eleanor had understood what the work took out of a person. Eleanor had understood a great many things Maggie did not yet understand about her mother. That was the shape of her life. Now her hands belonged to the garden and the orchard and the small, steady work of a life lived alone. With the photograph of Wendell on the mantel and the photograph of her mother on the wall by the kitchen and the photograph of Corinne and the 2 grandchildren on the refrigerator beside a postcard from Portland, that said "Love you, Mama" in her daughter's handwriting. The farm was hers. This had never been a question. Wendell had understood it the way people understand the ground rules of a life they have entered into willingly. The farm was Maggie's, had been her mother Eleanor's before her, would belong to Corinne when the time came. The deed was in the county records. The history was written in the land itself, in the way the fields had been kept and the orchard tended and the house maintained through the years by the women who had lived here. That October morning, the light was the particular gray of West Virginia autumn, and Maggie was in the kitchen garden picking the last of the pumpkins when she heard the truck come down the drive. She looked up. It was a truck she did not recognize. Large, black. The kind of truck that cost more than all the equipment in her barn, driven by a man she had not seen in perhaps 10 years, and would not have recognized on the street without prompting. Trevor Langston, the son of Wendell's cousin. A family connection attenuated enough that Maggie had never quite used the word relative without some internal qualification. He had been at Wendell's funeral briefly, standing at the edge of the gathering with a particular expression of someone performing presence. He had not cried. He had shaken her hand with a grip that was slightly too firm and had told her that if she needed anything, anything at all, he was family. She had thanked him for coming. She had not thought about him again. He got out of the truck with a leather folder under his arm. Another man stepped down from the passenger side, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone employed to appear authoritative. Trevor was 45, well-dressed in the way of men who want you to notice what they are wearing, with a smile that arrived a second before his eyes. "Aunt Maggie," he said. He said her name with the easy familiarity of a man who had been practicing the conversation and had decided that first names would establish a tone that served his purpose. "Trevor," she said. She set down her basket slowly. She wiped her hands on the apron she was wearing over her work clothes, not the old blue apron that hung in the kitchen, but a newer one, practical, a Christmas gift from Corinne 3 years ago. He explained the situation with the fluency of someone delivering an explanation rather than having one. It involved Wendell's estate, a will that had apparently been prepared in March of 2019, 3 years before his death. Arrangements that had been made without Maggie's knowledge, for reasons the document itself would explain, and the summary conclusion that the property at 847 Hollow Pine Road was to be transferred immediately to Trevor Langston as the named beneficiary. She asked to see the document. She read it carefully, standing in her own yard with Trevor and the attorney watching, in the way she read everything, methodically, from the beginning, without skipping. She had learned this from her mother, who had said more than once that the difference between the people who got taken advantage of and the people who did not was whether they read what they were signing. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Trevor, and her voice was very quiet. "That is not my husband's signature." She had looked at Wendell's signature on documents for 49 years. She knew the way the W at the start of Wendell broke slightly at the top, a small hitch in the pen stroke that he had never been able to smooth out. A leftover from the way he had been taught to hold a pen as a left-handed boy in a 1950s West Virginia schoolhouse. She knew the way he finished his last name without lifting the pen, sliding the final 2 letters into a single fluid shape. What was on this page was a careful approximation, the work of someone who had studied the original and reproduced it with attention, but not quite with the truth. Trevor's expression did not change in the way of someone surprised. It changed in the way of someone who had anticipated this response and had decided how to manage it. "The document was notarized, Aunt Maggie. I understand this is upsetting. Mr. Crane here is an attorney. He can answer any questions you have." Mitchell Crane was 52, tall with a prepared face. He said what attorneys say when they are on the wrong side of something and know it and have decided to continue anyway. "Mrs. Whitfield, I've spoken to your daughter Corinne about this. She's been concerned about your cognitive state for some time. She agrees this is the right arrangement going forward." Maggie went still. She had not spoken to Corinne in 3 weeks. Her daughter was in Portland, Oregon, 2,000 miles away, an architect with two children of her own, a woman who called every Sunday night without fail and always closed the call with the same three words: "I love you, Mama." The idea that Corinne had been having conversations with Trevor Langston and Mitchell Crane about Maggie's cognitive state was a thing that made no sense in any world she recognized. She said nothing. She had learned in 72 years that silence is often more powerful than protest, and that men like Trevor often reveal themselves fastest when you give them the space to keep talking. If this has ever happened to you, if someone has ever stood in your own yard and tried to convince you that your life was not yours, type the word "heard" in the comments below. I want to know you are with me, because what happens next is going to matter. By noon, two additional men had arrived in a second truck and had begun moving through her house with the systematic efficiency of people performing an inventory. They opened the drawers of the dresser in the back bedroom where Maggie had been born. They looked inside the linen closet where Eleanor had kept the quilts her grandmother had pieced during the Depression. They walked through Wendell's workshop in the barn and ran their hands over the tools he had arranged by size on the pegboard wall, the way he had arranged them for 40 years. By 2 o'clock, the locks had been changed on the front door while Maggie stood in the yard and watched. The locksmith, a young man with the logo of a company she did not recognize on the back of his jacket, would not meet her eyes. By 3 o'clock, Trevor was standing on the porch of the house that had been in her family for 3 generations, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who believed he had won. "You're welcome to take what you can carry," he said. "I'd make it quick. I've got people coming tomorrow to start clearing the south field." "The south field," she said. "The orchard." He smiled the same practiced smile. "We're breaking ground on Monday. Hollow Pine Estates, 24 luxury homes. You should see the renderings, Aunt Maggie. It's going to be beautiful." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she could say, and what would be useful to say, and what the difference was between those two things. She had spent her whole life understanding that difference. "The apron," she said. "My mother's apron. It's on the hook in the kitchen. I'd like to take that." Trevor went inside and came back a minute later with it. He held it out without ceremony, the way you hand someone something you consider worthless. The fabric was old, the faded blue of a color that had once been stronger, worn smooth in places from 60 years of use. The stains of 6 decades of gardening and kitchen work permanently set into the cloth. A small tear at the lower left pocket that Eleanor had patched herself in 1982 with thread that no longer quite matched. "Take it, old woman." He was smiling. "That rag isn't worth the threads it's made of." She took it. She folded it carefully over her arm. Then she turned and walked south toward the orchard, because there was nowhere else to go, and because the orchard had always been where she went when she needed to think. Behind her, she heard Trevor on his phone. She could not hear all of it. She caught the words that mattered. "Yeah, it's done. The transfer goes through Monday morning before anyone starts asking questions. Just make sure your end is ready." She kept walking. She did not let her back move. She did not let her shoulders drop. She did not let him see anything he could use. The apple orchard covered roughly 3 acres on the south side of the farm, running from the fence line at the road to the creek at the back of the property. Eleanor had planted it herself in 1968 with Maggie beside her, the two of them setting each tree into the ground with the focused care of people who understand they are making a decision for decades rather than seasons. Eleanor had called them iron trees. That was not a variety name. It was her mother's own. Her way of naming the hardiness of the apple stock she had chosen, a heritage variety she had sourced from an elderly orchardist named Silas up in Kentucky, who had been growing them since before the war. Trees that produced a small, dense, intensely flavored apple that was not beautiful by commercial standards, but that kept through the winter and made a cider unlike anything Maggie had ever tasted from any other source. Eleanor had brought the saplings home in the bed of Maggie's father's truck wrapped in wet burlap. She had lined them up in the yard. She had said to 14-year-old Maggie standing barefoot in the summer grass, "We are going to plant these together, and someday when you are old, they will still be here, and they will still know your name." Maggie had not understood then what her mother meant. She understood now. The orchard had not been well for some years. This was a grief Maggie carried quietly. The knowledge that the trees Eleanor had planted with such intention were declining in ways she had not been able to prevent. She had consulted an extension agent from the state university. She had tried remedies recommended by older orchardists in 3 counties. She had given the orchard the same attention she gave everything, and the trees had continued their slow withdrawal. Trevor's assessment, the south field, something to be cleared, was not wrong about the appearance of the orchard. He was wrong about everything else, which was the particular wrongness of a man who could look at a living thing and see only what it was worth to cut down. Maggie walked through the orchard gate and stopped. The trees stood around her in the October afternoon, their branches mostly bare, a few stubborn leaves holding on in rust and gold. The light came through them at the angle of late autumn that made even bare branches look like something sacred. She walked to the center of the orchard. The central tree was the first one Eleanor had planted, the one she had put in the ground before any of the others, establishing the heart of the arrangement from which everything else radiated. It was the largest tree, or had been. It was now reduced, its crown thinned, several major branches gone to the blight that had been working through the orchard. But the trunk was still substantial, the root system still anchored deeply into the West Virginia clay. Maggie sat down at the base of the tree with her back against the trunk, the way she had sat as a child while Eleanor read to her. Her mother had read to her here through summers and autumns, the two of them against this trunk with the orchard around them and the farm beyond it, in the particular quality of Appalachian afternoon that made everything feel both immediate and eternal. Eleanor had read her Little Women and The Secret Garden and the poems of Emily Dickinson, which Maggie had not understood at 9 but had loved for the sound of. Eleanor had told her the names of birds by their songs alone. Eleanor had said that a woman who knew her land could never be truly lost, and Maggie at the time had not known her mother meant it literally. She held the apron in her lap. It was old, older than she remembered it looking. The fabric had the translucency of cloth that has been washed hundreds of times over decades. There were stains that no amount of washing had fully removed. She pressed the apron to her face and breathed in. The faint ghost of lavender was there. The lavender water Eleanor had made herself every summer from the plants in the kitchen garden. Faint, nearly gone, but present in the way that scents embedded in fabric over decades of use do not entirely disappear. It was enough. Maggie allowed herself for a long time to grieve, not strategically, not as a managed process, the real thing. The compound grief of a woman who had lost her husband and now her home, who was sitting in the orchard her dead mother had planted, holding her dead mother's apron, with no clear path forward. She cried until she could not cry anymore. Then she stopped, because she had learned over a long life that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a passage to be moved through, and that the orchard was not going to take care of itself, and that Trevor Langston was going to be very surprised in ways he could not yet imagine by what Maggie Whitfield decided to do next. The sun set behind the ridge at 6:27. The temperature dropped quickly after that in the way October temperatures drop in the West Virginia hills. Maggie pulled the apron around her shoulders. She did not move. She was not going back to the house. The house was locked. The locks had been changed by a man who had no right to change them, and she was not going to break a window to enter her own home. Not because she was incapable of it, but because that was not how she operated. So she slept in the orchard. She had not done that since she was 12 years old, when she and a friend named Betty Calloway had convinced themselves it was an adventure and had woken at 3 in the morning convinced of exactly the opposite. Betty Calloway had been Henry Calloway's older sister. Betty had died of cancer in 1998. Maggie thought about Betty now, about the way Betty had laughed in the dark that summer, about how long ago that was. At 72, she found it harder than she had at 12. The October ground was cold. The dew came down heavy by midnight. The apron around her shoulders was not much warmth, but it was something. Her back ached in the way it had ached since her 30s. Her knees protested the cold. The old pain in her left hip that she had managed with stretches for a decade woke up fully for the first time in years. She held the apron close to her chest through the cold hours of the night. If her hands passed over something small and hard in the hem during those hours, she did not notice. She was not looking for anything. She was only trying to survive until morning, trying to hold on to the lavender smell, trying to feel her mother in the cloth. She did not cry again. She had done her crying. What she did instead was think. She thought about Trevor's phone call. She thought about the way he had cut off the call quickly when he saw her listening. She thought about the word transfer and the phrase before anyone starts asking questions. A man without accomplices does not worry about anyone at the county office. A man without a tight schedule does not say Monday morning like it is a deadline. She thought about Corinne, about whether Corinne had really been part of this. Her daughter was many things, but she was not a person who would do this to her mother. The Mitchell Crane story was a lie. Maggie was certain of this the way she was certain of her own name, which meant Trevor had been lying to cover the fact that Corinne did not know any of it was happening. She thought about Patricia Ruth Hadley, who had worked at the Ashfield County Courthouse for 32 years. Ruth had gone to school with Eleanor in the 1940s at the old two-room schoolhouse that was a historical marker now. Ruth still lived out on Sycamore Ridge, 3 miles north. Ruth had been at Eleanor's funeral. Ruth had stood in the receiving line and had said to Maggie, "Your mother was the finest woman I have ever known, and one day you will understand what that really means." Ruth would know what to do. She thought about Sheriff Dashiell Moreno, who had been in Corinne's graduating class at Ashfield Hollow High School in 1998. Dashiell had been the kind of quiet boy who worked summers on a road crew and saved his money for college. He had grown up into a quiet man who took his job seriously. Corinne had told Maggie once that Dashiell Moreno was one of the reasons she still thought kindly of Ashfield Hollow. By the time the sky turned from black to the first gray of morning, Maggie had a list. She got up slowly, the way 72-year-old women get up from the ground in October. Her hip cracked, her back held at a careful angle until she could coax it upright. She stretched until she could stand. She folded the apron properly and put it on, tying it at the back the way her mother had always worn it. The ties looped twice and knotted at the front. She did not know why this felt important, but it did. Then she walked out of the orchard toward the road. If you are listening to this and something about this story is reminding you of someone, of your own mother, or of a woman you loved, take a breath. You are not alone. Type the name of that woman in the comments. Let us remember them together, because what Maggie finds next is going to remind us all why they mattered. She walked 4 miles along County Road 19 to the Chevron station at the intersection of the old highway. Her feet were not ready. The shoes she had been wearing to pick pumpkins were not shoes for walking 4 miles. By the time she reached the gas station, she was limping, and she had to sit down on the curb outside for 10 minutes before she could walk inside. She had $340 cash in her wallet. She had an ATM card for the shared checking account she kept with Wendell's Memorial Money. She bought coffee and a breakfast biscuit she was not hungry for, but knew she needed. She asked the woman at the counter if she could use the phone. The woman looked at her. Really looked. She was maybe 50, with the hands of a woman who had worked all her life, with gray in her hair that she had not bothered to cover. "You okay, honey?" "I will be." The woman nodded and pushed the phone across the counter. Maggie called Corinne's cell number from memory. It rang 4 times. Corinne picked up on the 5th ring, her voice thin. "Mama, why are you calling from an unknown number?" "Honey." Maggie's voice wanted to break. She did not let it. "I need you to listen very carefully. Did you talk to a man named Trevor Langston?" Or a lawyer named Mitchell Crane? In the last 3 weeks? A long pause. No, Mama, who are those people? Maggie closed her eyes. She told her daughter, as briefly as she could, what had happened. She heard Corinne begin to cry on the other end of the line. She heard her daughter say that she was going to get on the next plane. Honey, wait. Where are you right now? Mama, I had emergency surgery 4 days ago. I'm not supposed to travel for 2 weeks. I can't, I can't get there fast, Mama. Oh my God. Maggie breathed. Corinne, listen to me. You stay where you are. You heal. I am going to handle this. I need you to know that I am handling this, and I need you to stay where you are. I will call you tonight. I will call you every night until this is done. Mama, please, let me call somebody. Let me call the sheriff. I am going to call the sheriff, honey. I am going to do all of this. I am your mother. I have handled harder things than this. She was not sure if that was true, but she said it, and saying it made it true enough to continue. When she hung up, she tried her ATM card at the gas station machine. The card was declined. She tried again. Account frozen. She stood in the Chevron station at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning with $340 cash to her name, her shoes wrong for walking, her hip screaming, her account frozen by a man she now understood was going to try to starve her into agreement. She walked back to the counter. Ma'am, she said to the woman, do you know where Callaway's Hardware is in Ashfield Hollow? I understand Henry has a small room at the back. I'm looking for a place to stay tonight. The woman wrote out directions on a napkin. Henry's a good man, honey. You tell him Donna from the station sent you. He'll do right by you. Maggie caught the 8 o'clock bus into Ashfield Hollow. The bus dropped her at the corner of Main and Locust, 2 blocks from the hardware store. She walked the 2 blocks slowly. Callaway's Hardware sat on Main Street between the post office and a coffee shop that had not opened yet for the day. The front windows showed displays of drill bits, canning supplies, and a hand-lettered sign advertising keys cut while you wait. The door had a bell that rang when Maggie pushed it open. Henry Callaway was 70 years old, tall and thin, with a white mustache that looked trimmed by habit rather than vanity. He was standing behind the counter with reading glasses on the end of his nose, working on a small lock in a vise. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her in the apron, at the dirt on her shoes, at whatever was visible in her face. He set the lock down. You're Eleanor Blackwood's girl. Maggie nodded. I heard trouble came to your place yesterday. He took off the reading glasses. Donna at the Chevron called 10 minutes ago. Said you might be headed this way. I was hoping you had a room. I do. It's not fancy. I do not need fancy. No, Henry Callaway said. I expect you don't. He led her through a door at the back of the shop. The room was small, a single bed with a clean quilt, a wooden chair, a lamp, a window that looked out at the alley behind the shop. The room had the particular order of a man who lived alone and kept things precisely where they belonged. My Dorothy passed 3 years ago, Henry said, as if answering a question she had not asked. This was her sewing room. I keep it made up for when my sister comes down from Wheeling. You stay as long as you need. No charge. Mr. Callaway, I cannot. You can. Your mother back in 1982, when my Dorothy first got sick, your mother drove a pot of soup to our kitchen every Thursday for 7 months. 7 months, Mrs. Whitfield. She never once asked how we were. She just kept bringing the soup. Dorothy talked about that for the rest of her life, said it was the only thing that kept her believing in anything that whole year. Maggie sat down on the bed because her hip would not hold her anymore. I did not know that, she said. Henry Callaway nodded once. Your mother was something else. Most people in this county didn't know half of what she did. He paused at the door. There's coffee in the front. Come out when you're ready. He closed the door behind him. Maggie sat on the bed for a long time with her hands folded in her mother's apron. Then she got up and she washed her face at the little sink in the corner. And she went out to the front of the shop and she accepted the mug of coffee Henry Calloway had set on the counter for her. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the two of them, the shop bell quiet, the morning light coming through the front window. Henry went back to working on his lock. Maggie watched him work. After a time, he said, "You need anything from me today? You say so." "I need a phone book," she said, "and a quiet place to make some calls." "Back room's quiet. Phone's on the wall." She went into the back room with the phone book, and she began. She called the sheriff's office first. Dashiell Moreno was not in. The deputy who answered, a young man named Kyle, took her name and her callback number at Henry's shop. She called Ruth Hadley's office at the courthouse. Ruth was in a meeting. The receptionist took a message. She called her bank. She was told that her account had been frozen pending a review of a change of signatory document submitted yesterday. She was told that the review would take 5 to 7 business days. She was told that there was nothing that could be done in the meantime. She hung up that call carefully, the way you hang up a call when what you want to do is throw the phone. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about what 5 to 7 business days meant. Trevor had said the crews were coming Monday. Today was Tuesday. 5 business days from Tuesday was the following Tuesday. By then, the orchard would be gone. By then, the house would have been cleared, the locks rekeyed again, the property listing up on whatever website Trevor used. By then, it would not matter what her bank eventually decided about her own money. She stood up. She went out to the front. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "do you have an old smartphone I could borrow? Just for a few days. I need to look some things up." Henry went into the back of the store. He came out with an iPhone that was a generation or two old but still functional, its charger coiled neatly around it. "This was Dorothy's," he said. "The bill's still paid. You use it as long as you need." Maggie held it carefully. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, Mrs. Whitfield. You haven't thanked me yet, and I don't expect you to. Your mother made me enough soup for a lifetime." She went back into the room. She sat down on the bed. She figured out slowly how to turn the phone on. She figured out how to open the browser. She began to type with 2 fingers the words "property fraud, West Virginia, forged will." The next morning, she walked to the Ashfield County Public Library. It was a small building, 1 story, the kind of library that had been expanded in the 1980s and not much since. The librarian at the front desk was a woman around Maggie's age with a name tag that said Joyce. Maggie did not know Joyce, but Joyce seemed to recognize her. "Are you Eleanor Blackwood's daughter?" "I am." "I thought so. You have her eyes." Joyce smiled. "Anything I can help you find today, honey. I need to understand family trusts and forged wills in West Virginia, and I am sorry to say I need to understand them today." Joyce looked at her for a long moment. Then she walked around the desk. "Come with me." Joyce set Maggie up at a reading table with 3 books, a legal aid pamphlet, and a list of relevant West Virginia statutes printed from a state government website. She brought her a cup of coffee from the staff room without being asked. She did not ask Maggie why she needed any of this. Maggie spent 6 hours at that table. She learned that forged wills were a felony under West Virginia law. She learned that notarization could itself be fraudulent if the notary was part of the conspiracy, and that a notary seal, while persuasive, was not proof of the document's authenticity. She learned that mineral rights, timber rights, and agricultural trusts could be separately held from the surface deed, and that certain kinds of family trusts, when properly executed, could make a property effectively unsellable without the consent of the named trustee. She learned that in West Virginia, trusts filed before 1960 were stored on microfilm in the state archive, but that the original instruments, if they had been filed correctly, would still exist in the county courthouse archive, pulled out only on request. She did not know what any of that meant for her specific situation, but she wrote it all down on a yellow legal pad Henry had given her in her careful cursive, and she began to make a plan. She called one lawyer in Charleston, a woman whose name had come up in her searches as an expert in elder fraud. The receptionist told her the initial consultation fee was $5,000. Maggie thanked her and hung up. Joyce came by the table around 3. You look like you've been punched in the stomach, honey. I have been, just not where it shows. Joyce sat down across from her. Listen, she said quietly. I don't know what's going on. I don't need to know. But there's a woman named Ruth Hadley at the courthouse. If what you're dealing with has anything to do with property, Ruth is the person you want, and she'll know who to put you in touch with. You go find Ruth. That's the best advice I can give you. I know Ruth. Good. Then go find her. And honey, if you need a ride back into town, you let me know before 5. Maggie walked back to Calloway's Hardware that afternoon with a yellow legal pad in her purse and her mother's apron tied twice around her waist. Her hip hurt. Her feet hurt. Her eyes hurt from reading small print for 6 hours. But she had a plan, or something close enough to one. She would go to Ruth Hadley tomorrow. She would bring her yellow pad. She would figure out what to do from there. She sat on a bench in Ashfield Hollowtown Park for a few minutes before going back to Henry's. The park was small, a square of grass with 4 benches, a flagpole, and a fountain that had been turned off for the season. The wind was cold. Her hip hurt more than it had hurt in years. She thought for the first time in her life about giving up, not about ending anything, just about letting it go. Taking her $340 and whatever a bus ticket cost and riding it to Portland and showing up on Corinne's doorstep and letting her daughter take care of her for whatever time she had left. Letting Trevor have the orchard, letting the iron trees come down, letting the house go to a man who would turn the kitchen into a showroom. She sat with that thought for a long time, and then she heard Eleanor in her head, as clearly as if her mother had been sitting on the bench beside her. The iron trees survive, Maggie, because their roots go deeper than anyone thinks. Maggie opened her eyes. She looked down at her mother's apron, tied twice around her waist. She ran her hand along the worn fabric, a gesture so habitual it required no thought. Her fingers stopped. There, in the hem, something hard, something small, sewn into the fold of the stitching, invisible unless you were looking for it, or unless your hands found it the way hands find things they were meant to find. Maggie sat very still in the October afternoon. 60 years, she thought. How had she never felt this before? She walked the 3 blocks back to Calloway's Hardware faster than her hip wanted to carry her. Henry was helping a customer at the front. Maggie went straight to the back room. She closed the door. She sat on the bed and turned the apron over in her lap. The thing in the hem was small and rectangular and hard. Her fingers found the edges. Something the size of a key, maybe. She picked up the sewing kit Dorothy had left in the little basket on the dresser. She selected the smallest seam ripper. She worked the stitching of the hem carefully, the way Eleanor had taught her to work delicate things, slowly, without force, finding the give rather than creating it. The hem opened. Something fell into her palm. She sat for a long moment looking at it. It was a key, small, bronze, worn smooth at the edges, with a specific profile of a key made to fit one particular lock and no other. On the flat of the key's head, barely visible in the afternoon light from the window, someone had scratched a small symbol, a tree, simple, 2 lines for trunk, a curve for crown. She kept working the hem, because if there was a key, there might be something else. There was. A small folded square of paper, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth that had kept it dry through whatever years it had been there. The paper was yellowed and fragile at the folds, but it held when she opened it carefully. The handwriting was Eleanor's. Maggie would have known it anywhere. The particular forward slant. The letters formed with the deliberate care of a woman who had taught herself to write well and had never stopped taking the act seriously. My sweet Margaret, by the time you find this, I will be gone. I have sewn this key into the hem of this apron because I know you will keep the apron the way you keep everything that matters, carefully and close. And I know that someday you will need what the key opens. though I pray it is not from desperate circumstances. Under our tree, the first one I planted, the heart of the orchard, there is a box. It has been there since 1956. You must dig at the east side of the roots, at the place where the largest root meets the trunk above ground, where the bark has always grown in a curve that looks like a sleeping eye. Inside the box is what I saved. Not money, my darling. I never had money to save. What I saved is something I believed mattered more, and something I believed would protect you if you ever needed protecting. The land is yours. It has always been yours. I made certain of it. The roots that feed us are the same roots that protect us. I have always believed this. I built my whole life on it, and I built your inheritance on it too. Find the box. Read every letter. Trust what you find. All of my love across whatever distance separates us. Your mother, Eleanor Maggie, read the letter twice, then a third time. Then she folded it back into the oilcloth and put it inside her shirt, close to her body. She looked at the key. She looked at the clock on Dorothy's dresser. 4:23. The sun would set at 6:31. Trevor had said the crews were coming Monday. Today was Wednesday. She had 3 nights before the machines rolled in. She went out to the front of the shop. Henry was wrapping a small package for a customer. When the customer left, Maggie stood at the counter and said quietly, "Henry, I need to ask you something strange." "Ask." "I need a shovel, a small one, a flashlight, and I need somebody to drive me back to my own orchard tonight, after dark." Henry Calloway looked at her across the counter. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "it would be my honor. If you have followed Maggie to this orchard, if you know what it feels like to dig in the dark for something your mother left you, pause right now. Hit that like button to let the algorithm know this story deserves to reach every woman who needs to hear it. The truth is about to come out of the ground, and it has been waiting 60 years. Henry drove her in his blue pickup with the headlights off for the last quarter mile. They left the truck on the shoulder of the county road and walked through the tree line that edged the north side of the property. The moon was 3/4 full. The October air smelled of wood smoke from someone's chimney down the valley. A dog barked once, far away, and then stopped. There were lights on in the farmhouse. Trevor's truck was in the drive. Another truck Maggie did not recognize was parked beside it. They circled wide through the hayfield and came up on the orchard from the back. The orchard was quiet. Henry had a small flashlight with a red filter that would not carry far in the dark. Maggie led him to the central tree. She felt for the east side of the trunk, ran her hand down to where the largest root met the ground above the earth. Felt for the curve in the bark. It was there. She had walked past it 10,000 times without ever registering it as a landmark. The way you see things so often, they become invisible. "Here," she whispered. Henry set the shovel down and handed her a pair of work gloves. She began to dig. The West Virginia clay was hard with weeks of October dryness. She worked carefully so as not to damage the root system more than necessary, scraping earth away a handful at a time. Her back began to ache almost immediately. Her hip wanted her to sit down. She did not. She dug for 40 minutes with a small shovel, and with her hands and with a flat rock she used to loosen the packed clay. Henry knelt beside her, holding the red-filtered light. She dug in the wrong place first. The east side, yes, but the wrong part of the east side. She hit nothing but roots and more clay. She sat back on her heels. She read Eleanor's letter again by the little red light. The place where the bark has always grown in a curve that looks like a sleeping eye. She ran her hand over the bark again, and she realized she had been on the north side of the east face, not the true east. She moved over 10 inches. The curve in the bark was right there, a shape that did, if you were looking for it, look like a closed eye, a sleeping eye. She started digging again. 20 minutes later, her shovel hit something that was not soil and not root. Henry leaned in with the light. Metal, the top of a container, its surface rough with decades of soil contact, but intact. She cleared the surface carefully. She worked around it, finding the edges, understanding its dimensions. Larger than she had expected, rectangular, heavy when she tested it. It took another 15 minutes to free it. When they finally worked it clear of the soil and set it on the ground between them, Maggie sat back and looked at it. It was a military ammunition box, the kind used in the Second World War. Heavy gauge steel designed to be airtight and waterproof and durable under field conditions. Someone had wrapped it additionally in what had been a leather saddlebag, the leather now stiff with age but still largely intact. The combination of metal and leather had done exactly what her mother had intended it to do. It had kept what was inside safe through 60 years of West Virginia seasons. She worked the leather loose. The metal box beneath was sealed with a clasp, and the clasp lock was the exact size and shape of the bronze key in her hand. She turned the key in the lock. The clasp released with the sound of something that had been closed for a very long time, opening for the first time. "Mrs. Whitfield," Henry whispered, "we ought to take this somewhere we can see it." She nodded. They carried it back to the truck in Henry's saddlebag. They filled the hole back in carefully, scattering leaves and bark fragments over the disturbed earth. Henry walked the dig site one more time with the red light, checking for anything Maggie might have dropped. When he was satisfied, they walked back out the way they had come. They drove back to Callaway's Hardware in silence. Maggie sat in the passenger seat with the box on her lap and her hands resting on the lid, and her heart beating harder than it had beaten in years. At the shop, Henry put on a pot of coffee. He set a lamp on the counter. He brought out a clean cloth and laid it down. Maggie opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them from moisture, were bundles of envelopes. Many bundles, each tied with a piece of kitchen string that had dried and stiffened over the decades. The envelopes were of various ages and sizes, addressed in different hands. Some formal, some barely legible, some in the careful block letters of people for whom writing was effortful. They were all addressed to Eleanor Blackwood, her mother's maiden name. At the farm address on Hollow Pine Road, Maggie realized, sitting there in Henry Callaway's hardware store at 2 in the morning, that she had never known her mother at all. She lifted the first bundle and opened one envelope carefully. The letter inside was dated October 1952. It was from a man named Thaddeus Aldridge, Sergeant, United States Army. It was written from a veterans hospital in Georgia, where he was recovering from wounds sustained in Korea. He wrote to thank a woman, Eleanor Blackwood, who had written to him every month for 2 years while he was overseas, who had sent packages of food and small useful items, and who had, he wrote, kept him connected to the idea of home when home felt impossibly far away. He wrote that he did not know how to repay her except with gratitude. He wrote that he was enclosing a small token, a silver dollar from the year of his birth, 1921, as a way of marking the occasion of his survival. Maggie found the coin in the envelope, smooth and cool between her fingers. She opened another. A letter from a woman named Clara Mae Jenkins, dated 1967, thanking Eleanor for helping her family through a winter when Clara's husband had been sick and the farm was failing, for the meals left at the door, for the money tucked into the meal basket without comment or expectation of return. A coin enclosed, a walking Liberty $50 that had belonged to Clara's grandmother, and that she wanted Eleanor to have as a keepsake of the kindness between them. Another, a letter from Reverend Ezekiel Brown dated 1974 from a small black congregation 2 counties over whose church building had burned in a fire. Somebody, he wrote, had left an envelope of cash on his desk at the rectory 3 days after the fire, enough cash to start rebuilding. No name, no note. But he had heard a rumor years later about who, and he wanted her to know that the church had been rebuilt, and that it stood, and that when his children prayed in it, they prayed for her even without knowing who she was. A Morgan dollar enclosed. Another, a letter from the Hollister family dated 1981, after the father had died in a coal mine collapse. 4 children, a widow who could not work. Eleanor had somehow, quietly, arranged for a year of groceries to be delivered every week to that trailer. The widow, Ida Hollister, had tracked down the name of the benefactor through the grocery store owner years later. The letter enclosed a small silver ring that had belonged to the widow's grandmother. Another, a letter from a young woman named Patricia Moss, dated 1989, thanking Eleanor for the $75 that had appeared in her mailbox the week she was trying to leave an abusive husband. $75 had been enough for the bus ticket to her sister's house in Ohio. Patricia Moss was now a pediatric nurse. She had never known who had left the money, but the check she had received from a lawyer in 2016, she wrote, had come with a note in the same handwriting as a letter Eleanor had sent her at her sister's address back in 1990, and she had finally understood. The coin she enclosed had been her grandmother's wedding dime, 1912. Another, a letter from a man named Walter Briggs, dated 1997, whose house had burned in a grease fire and who had had no insurance and 4 children. Someone had paid for the rebuild through a contractor who would never say who. Walter Briggs had figured it out eventually. A standing Liberty Quarter enclosed, 1930, bundle after bundle, letter after letter, soldiers, families, neighbors, strangers who had become known through kindness, people whose lives had intersected with Eleanor's through the years of her generosity. A generosity Maggie was understanding as she read that had been entirely private, entirely uncelebrated, entirely her mother's own. And each letter had come with a coin. Some silver dollars, some half dollars, some foreign coins from soldiers who had been stationed abroad, a few gold coins, a few ones Maggie could not identify, with dates and events she could not immediately place. Hundreds of coins in total, each one a thank you, each one a record of a kindness given and received. Maggie had known her mother as a kind woman. She had not known the scale of it. She had not known that her mother had been writing to soldiers for years, had been feeding families through hard winters, had been slipping cash into the mailboxes of women who needed to get away from men who hurt them, had been quietly and consistently doing the work of care that does not appear in any record because it was never meant to. Henry was not reading over her shoulder. He was standing at the window of the shop, looking out at the empty Main Street, giving her the privacy this deserved. After some time, he said, "There's something else in the box, Mrs. Whitfield." She looked. Under the last bundle, separated from the others, there was an envelope sealed with red wax that had hardened over the decades, addressed in Eleanor's handwriting to Margaret specifically. Maggie did not open it yet. She set it aside. She needed to understand the rest first. In the morning, Henry drove her 90 minutes north to Morgantown. He had made a phone call at 7. By 9, they were sitting across the desk of Dr. Evelyn Pierce, a numismatist who had been appraising coins at the same shop on Willie Street for 31 years. Dr. Pierce spread a jeweler's cloth across the table. She picked up the first coin. She set down her reading glasses. She picked up a loupe. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she looked up at Maggie. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "do you understand what you have here?" "I do not," Maggie said. "This is a chronicle. Each of these coins is dated in a way that corresponds to a specific human life, and several of them, Mrs. Whitfield, are rare in the way that changes a collector's entire year. The Morgan silver dollar from 1893 alone, in this condition, is worth in the neighborhood of $120,000. You have 2 of them." Maggie sat very still. "The rest of the collection," Dr. Pierce said, "will need a full appraisal. But my preliminary estimate, Mrs. Whitfield, is that the coins in this box are worth somewhere between $330,000 and $350,000. Henry Calloway, who had been sitting quietly in the chair beside Maggie, took his hat off slowly. "Jesus, Mrs. Whitfield," he said softly. Maggie did not cry. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she thought about Eleanor, who had accepted the first coin from a wounded soldier in Georgia in 1952 without ever imagining what it would become. Eleanor had not kept the coins for their value. She had kept them because they were thank yous, because each one represented a person she had loved in the quiet way she loved people. She had buried a record of her own goodness in the ground under an apple tree and left it for a daughter who would need it 60 years later. If what Eleanor Blackwood built with 60 years of quiet kindness has reached you, type one word in the comments right now. Just one. The first word that comes to your heart. I read every single one. Now let me show you what else was inside that box. Dr. Pierce, Maggie said, I am not selling any of this. Dr. Pierce looked at her. I understand. I need a letter from you, a formal appraisal, today, if you can manage it. I need it because I'm going to show it to a sheriff and a county clerk, and I want them to know what kind of woman my mother was when they hear what happens next. Dr. Pierce nodded once. I can have it to you by 3 o'clock. They stopped for lunch at a diner on the way home. Maggie ordered the soup and drank 2 cups of coffee. Henry ordered a sandwich and did not make her talk until she was ready. She took the sealed envelope out of her purse. She broke the wax seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a property deed, the original deed to the farm on Hollow Pine Road, registered in the county records on the 14th of March, 1956, in the name of Eleanor Ruth Blackwood. Along with it, a notation establishing the property in a family trust of specific terms. The second document was the trust itself, handwritten in the careful formal language of the period, witnessed and notarized by Judge Ezra Willoughby of Asheville County. The trust terms were clear. The property was held in perpetual trust for the female lineage of the Blackwood family, to pass from mother to daughter in direct line. It could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered by any means other than the consent of the current female heir. The trust was irrevocable. Maggie's name was on it, not Wendell's name, not Trevor's name, hers, Margaret Ruth Blackwood Whitfield, daughter of Eleanor Ruth Blackwood, sole heir of the Blackwood Women's Perpetual Trust. She sat with the documents in her hands in the booth at the diner, and she began to understand, for the first time, exactly who she was. She came from a woman who had prepared for this morning in 1956, 7 decades before it happened, who had known with the specific clarity that came from whatever Eleanor had seen in her own life, that someday someone would try to take what Maggie's family had built, who had made arrangements that would hold up in any court in any state, and had buried them in the ground under an apple tree, and had trusted her daughter to find them when she needed them. A second letter was folded inside the trust document. Maggie opened it. My Margaret, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong. I pray it is only my death that has brought you here, and that you are finding these papers as a formality of inheritance. But I am a practical woman, and I have seen enough of the world to know that formalities are not always what bring daughters to their mother's hidden things. In 1955, when I was carrying you, a man came to our door. His name does not matter now. He was related to your father through a second marriage. He came with papers he said your father had signed, papers that would have given him a substantial share of this land. He was wrong. Your father had not signed them, but it took us 4 months and most of the money we had to prove it. I swore that day that no daughter of mine would ever have to prove it again. The trust I created in 1956 is the oldest instrument of its kind in Asheville County. Judge Willoughby helped me write it. He was a good man. He believed that women who worked the land should keep the land. He filed it in the county records on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and he told me that day that the trust would hold for as long as the records existed, and that the records would exist as long as the county did. I am telling you this, Margaret, because I want you to know that I did this for you, but I did not do it alone. I have always had help. The world has always had good people in it. Find them, trust them, and when your time comes to help someone else, do it quietly and do it without expecting thanks. All of my love, your mother, Eleanor. Maggie held the letter. She thought about a young pregnant woman in 1955, standing in the yard of this farm, being handed forged papers by a man who thought she was too weak to fight him. She thought about how that young woman had spent the next year of her life building a legal shelter so strong that 7 decades later, her daughter would be standing on the same ground, facing the same kind of man, holding the weapon her mother had forged. "Henry," Maggie said quietly, "I need to go see Ruth Hadley tomorrow morning. First thing." "I'll take you." She nodded. She folded the documents carefully and put them back inside her shirt, against her skin, where they would stay until she could hand them to someone who could act on them. Outside the diner window, the October afternoon was turning gold, the kind of light Eleanor had loved. They arrived at Ruth Hadley's house on Sycamore Ridge at 7:15 on Thursday morning. Ruth was already up. She was always already up. A woman of habit and early hours, 68 years old, who had told Maggie once at a church potluck that sleeping past 6 felt like a surrender. Ruth opened the door with the expression of someone who has seen something unexpected and is taking a moment to assess it fully. "Margaret Whitfield," she said, "what in the Lord's name has happened to you?" "Ruth, I need your help, and I need you to read something for me." Patricia Ruth Hadley was the county clerk. She had spent 32 years working with property records and legal documents, which meant she had a practiced eye for the difference between authentic documentation and its approximations. She read the trust document and the original deed while Maggie drank coffee at her kitchen table. She read them with the focused attention of a woman who was not going to say anything until she was certain of what she was saying. When she finished, she looked up. "Maggie," she said, "this is real, and it is ironclad. Whoever drafted what Trevor Langston showed you is going to prison." She pulled her phone off the charger. "Give me an hour." She made calls. Maggie sat at the table and drank coffee and looked out Ruth's window at the morning coming over the East Hills. Henry Calloway sat beside her with his hat in his lap. Neither of them spoke. Sheriff Dashiell Moreno arrived at 8:30. He was 55, a big quiet man who had been in Corinne's graduating class at Ashfield Hollow High School. He sat across from Maggie at Ruth's table and listened to the account of the previous 3 days with the focused attention of a man who was building a picture while she talked. He looked at the documents. He made his own calls. By 9 o'clock, there was a deputy at the courthouse pulling the original registry records. Records that had been sitting in the county archive undisturbed since 1956, patient in their folders through 7 decades of county business, exactly where they had been placed by the judge who had notarized Eleanor's document and filed it in the proper place. By 9:30, the records confirmed what the document showed: the trust registration, the date, the terms, the signature of Judge Willoughby, who had died in 1984, whose signature was preserved in the county archives for exactly this kind of comparison. Sheriff Moreno hung up his phone. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I want to run one more check. This man Trevor. I want to see if his name's come up anywhere else." "He isn't my cousin, Sheriff." "No, ma'am, I don't expect he is." By 10 o'clock, the FBI field office in Charleston had pulled records on Trevor Langston. What they found was a pattern. Trevor had attempted similar schemes against 4 other women, all widows over 70, in 3 other counties across West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. 2 of those cases had succeeded. 2 elderly widows had lost farms they had lived on their whole lives. Mitchell Crane was a disbarred attorney from Columbus who was operating on a revoked license. Darren Foss at First Ashfield Bank had been under internal review for 6 months. Sheriff Moreno closed his phone. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I believe we have enough to move." Ruth Hadley, who had not said much during the last hour, reached across the table and took Maggie's hand. "Are you ready, Maggie?" Maggie looked down at her mother's apron, tied twice around her waist. "Ruth," she said, "I have been ready for 60 years. I just did not know it." Ruth had been standing at the window of her own kitchen when she saw the black Cadillac Escalade pass on Sycamore Ridge Road, heading toward the courthouse. 10 minutes later, she had reached for her phone before the car had disappeared around the bend. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "he is headed in. Right now. Black Escalade. 2 men in the front, maybe a third. They are bringing papers." Sheriff Moreno was in position within 40 seconds. Special Agent Adrienne Martinez of the FBI, who had driven up from Charleston the night before and was waiting at the courthouse for exactly this purpose, was beside him. Two deputies stood at the side door of the property registration office. Trevor Langston did not know that he was walking into a room that had been waiting 90 seconds for his arrival. If you are still here with me, pause and take a breath. What happens next is the part Eleanor Blackwood planned for in 1956. It is the morning she buried a box for. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already. You do not want to miss what walks into the Ashfield County Courthouse next. At 10:22 on Thursday morning, Trevor Langston walked into the property registration office on the second floor of the Ashfield County Courthouse with Mitchell Crane beside him and Darren Foss waiting in the hallway. Trevor was well dressed. He was smiling. He was carrying a folder. He was telling the clerk at the counter, a woman named Wanda Benson, that he needed to process a transfer on a time-sensitive basis, that he had a buyer, that he needed this file today. Wanda Benson, who had been briefed 90 seconds earlier by Ruth Hadley on the internal phone, said, "Mr. Langston, if you'll just wait a moment, someone will be right with you." Trevor said, "I'd rather not wait. I'm on a schedule." "Oh," Wanda Benson said, "you don't have to wait long." The door at the side of the office opened. Sheriff Moreno came through at first, then two deputies, then FBI Special Agent Adrienne Martinez, then Ruth Hadley, then Margaret Whitfield. She was still wearing her mother's apron. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was calm. She stood between the sheriff and the county clerk, and she looked at Trevor Langston with the specific stillness of a woman who was entirely certain of where she stood. Trevor's face went pale. "Aunt Maggie." He tried the smile. It did not reach his eyes. "I am glad you are here. This has all been a misunderstanding. Corinne and I were just trying to protect you, and clearly there has been confusion. My daughter," Maggie said quietly, "is Corinne Whitfield Davis. She is recovering from surgery in Portland, Oregon. She has never spoken to you, not once, not ever. I know this because I called her from a gas station on Tuesday morning, and she was as surprised to hear your name as a person can be." Mitchell Crane began to move toward the door. "Sit down, Mr. Crane," Sheriff Moreno said. Mitchell Crane sat down. Trevor tried again. "Aunt Maggie, if you'll just look at the document Wendell signed." "My husband never signed any will transferring this property to you, Trevor. He couldn't have. He knew the trust existed. He spent 45 years respecting it. The signature on your document is a forgery, and I am going to show you why." She set the documents on the counter one by one. "This is the original 1956 deed," she said, "filed by my mother, Eleanor Blackwood, and notarized by Judge Ezra Willoughby of this county. This is the Blackwood Women's Perpetual Trust, which makes this property unsellable by anyone other than the named female heir. This is a letter from my mother written in 1956, explaining why she filed this trust. This is an appraisal letter from Dr. Evelyn Pierce of Morgantown, dated yesterday, on what she buried in the ground in 1956 alongside these documents." She set the last document down. "And this is the letter in my mother's hand, explaining that she did all of this because a man like you came to her door in 1955, and she promised herself that no daughter of hers would ever have to face a man like you without a weapon." Trevor looked at her, and for the first time his face changed. "You thought I was alone because I am 72, Maggie said. "You thought I was weak because I am a widow. You thought I was foolish because I did not have your lawyers and your money. But you forgot something, Trevor. You forgot that I come from women. Women who buried their secrets in tree roots. Women who fed soldiers and saved families and never asked for anything back. Women who filed documents in county archives in 1956 so that 70 years later, their daughters would have exactly what they needed. Women whose roots go deeper than you could ever reach." Sheriff Moreno stepped forward. "Trevor Langston, you are under arrest for forgery, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." He read Trevor his rights while the deputies moved in. Mitchell Crane did not resist. Darren Foss in the hallway was already weeping when the second deputy reached him, and he began confessing before he had been asked a single question. Trevor did not say anything. He looked for a long moment at Maggie Whitfield in her mother's apron. Then he looked away. The room was quiet. The other people in the office, two residents renewing property records and a young man filing a deed on a house he had just bought, were watching without any pretense of not watching. One of them, a woman in her late 50s, stepped forward slowly. "Excuse me," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield." Maggie turned. The woman was crying quietly, not dramatically, the particular crying of someone recognizing something they had carried for a very long time. "My name is Loretta Watson," the woman said. "I am Clara Mae Jenkins's daughter. My mother passed last year. She told me my whole life about the woman who saved our family in 1967. She never stopped talking about your mother. She said that when my daddy was sick and the farm was failing, a woman from Ashfield County brought meals to our door every Sunday for 7 months. My mother said that woman saved our lives?" Loretta Watson wiped her eyes. "I am sorry, I recognized the name when I heard the sheriff say Blackwood. I have been standing here shaking for 10 minutes. Maggie reached out and took Loretta Watson's hand. She did not say anything because she could not quite, not yet. She held on for a long time. If Eleanor Blackwood has ever shown up in your life in some way, through somebody else's mother, through somebody else's quiet kindness you never got to thank, type her name in the comments. Type your mother's name. Type the name of a woman who did the quiet work. Because this story is not just about Maggie, it is about all of them." 2 weeks later, Corinne flew home from Portland. She walked up the drive of the farm on Hollow Pine Road on a Saturday morning in November, with her suitcase and her healing incision, and her face that looked so much like Eleanor's face, it still stopped Maggie's breath sometimes. Maggie had been up since 5. She had coffee on. She had the kitchen warm. Ruth Hadley had driven out the day before to help get the house ready. Henry Calloway had changed the locks back to Maggie's own keys. They stood in the doorway together for a long time before either of them said anything. "Mama." "I know, honey." "Mama, I am so sorry I was not here." "You were where you were supposed to be, honey," Corinne cried. Maggie held her. Outside the kitchen window, the orchard stood in its November stillness. The iron trees bare now, but still standing. Their roots still holding, their branches waiting for the spring that would come. That night, after Corinne had fallen asleep in her childhood bedroom, Maggie walked out to the porch. The air was cold and clear. The stars over the ridge were the stars she had known her whole life. She thought about her mother and her grandmother and the young pregnant woman in 1955 who had been handed forged papers by a relative and had gone to work that same year to make sure her unborn daughter would never have to face the same thing. She thought about how long love could wait, how quietly it could work, how deep it could lay its roots. The legal resolution, as Ruth Hadley said later, was thorough. Thorough in the way of things done properly. Trevor Langston was charged in federal court with fraud, forgery, conspiracy, racketeering, and 4 additional counts tied to his prior schemes in other states. He would not see the outside of a federal prison for at least 15 years. The 2 widows who had lost their farms to his earlier schemes were contacted by federal prosecutors. Their cases were reopened. One of them, a woman in Ohio named Bernice Tuttle, got her farm back. The other, a woman in Pennsylvania, had already passed away, but her children received a substantial settlement. Mitchell Crane's license was formally revoked, and he faced his own federal charges. Darren Foss accepted a plea deal in exchange for full cooperation and testimony. The bank covered its exposure quietly, paid out a settlement to Maggie for the freezing of her account, and instituted new review procedures on trust-related property transfers that became a model adopted by several other regional banks in the state. Maggie did not sell the coins. She did not sell the letters. She donated $50,000 to a fund in West Virginia that supported elderly widows in legal distress in Eleanor Blackwood's name. She arranged for Dr. Evelyn Pierce to catalog the coin collection and produce a full appraisal so that Corinne and the grandchildren would know exactly what had been entrusted to their keeping. She put the coins in a safe deposit box in the small bank on Main Street in Ashfield Hollow, and she kept the letters in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, and she read them slowly, one at a time, through the winter that followed. In the summer of that same year, Loretta Watson drove up from Kentucky to visit Maggie on the farm. They walked the orchard together. Loretta brought a photograph of Clara Mae Jenkins that she wanted Maggie to have, a photograph from 1967 in which Clara was standing in front of a Kentucky farmhouse holding a little girl on her hip. That little girl was Loretta. Maggie gave her in return one of the letters her mother had written to Clara in 1967 that she had found in the box under the tree. They cried in the orchard together, and they became, in the way women of a certain age become, sisters. Henry Calloway still ran the hardware store, though he had begun talking about selling it. He and Maggie had dinner together every other Sunday at the diner on the old highway. They did not call it anything. They did not need to. Sometimes Ruth Hadley joined them. Sometimes she did not, and Maggie brought the orchard back. Frank Delacroix, a 62-year-old heritage apple specialist from the Virginia Piedmont, came in the spring to look at the iron trees. He spent 2 days walking the rows. He said that the trees were not gone, that the root systems were largely intact, that the above-ground decline had been disease-related and specific, and that with proper treatment and time, a significant portion of the orchard was recoverable. He used the word recoverable with the particular emphasis of a man who knew it mattered. Maggie began the treatment program he recommended. She learned what she needed to learn. She gave the orchard the attention her mother had given it. Consistent, patient, season by season. By the second spring, more than half the remaining trees had produced new growth. Cautious at first, the way living things returned to themselves after a long difficulty, then with increasing confidence as the season progressed. By the third spring, the orchard was in full bloom for the first time in years. Maggie stood in the orchard on a morning in May of the third year. She was 75 now. Corinne was with her, having flown out from Portland for the week. The grandchildren, 8 and 6, were running between the rows. Frank Delacroix stood off to the side with his hat in his hands, watching the trees, saying nothing because nothing needed saying. The central tree, the first one Eleanor had planted in 1968, the iron tree, was in full flower. The 8-year-old, whose name was Eleanor after her great-grandmother, came running up. "Grandma, why is that apron so important? You always wear it." Maggie knelt down, slowly, the way 75-year-old women kneel. She took off the apron and folded it carefully and held it out. "This apron belonged to my mother," she said. "Your great-grandmother Eleanor. She sewed something into this apron for me a long time ago. Something that saved our farm. Someday, when you are old enough, you will sew something important into it too. That is what we do in this family, honey. We plant things that outlast us." The child looked at the apron. "Like the trees?" "Like the trees." Maggie stood up. She put her hand on the bark of the central tree. The bark was warm from the May sun. The blossoms moved in a small wind above her. The orchard smelled like the particular sweetness of apple blossoms that she had breathed every April of her life on this farm, and had been afraid, in the hard months, that she would never smell again. "I found everything you left me, Mama," she said quietly, "and I am leaving something too." The wind came across the orchard. The petals moved on the iron trees, and the roots that had held for 60 years went on holding, the way they had always held, the way they had been planted to hold. If Maggie Whitfield's story has reached you, if Eleanor Blackwood has somehow shown up in your life through the mother or grandmother or aunt who did the quiet work, share this story with one woman today. Send it to your sister. Send it to your neighbor. Send it to somebody who needs to remember that her worth does not have an expiration date, and leave one word in the comments, just one word, that describes how you feel right now. I read every single one of them. I do. A warm embrace to each and every one of you. I will see you in the next story.